Welcome to the Whole Athlete Podcast, where we focus on discussing topics to help you become a fat burner, optimize health, and improve performance in life and sports. Transform the whole you from the inside out with the holistic method. Let's dive in. Here's your host, Debbie Potts.
Hey everybody, it's Debbie Potts, and I'm doing a special show again with Peter Defty to talk about OFM, optimized fat metabolism. So we're going to dive into the process. What happens when we start going from a standard American diet and eating lots of high carbs as an athlete, and we start to switch to a low carb keto type of diet, eating more healthy fats and good grass-fed proteins and lowering our carbohydrates. But what happens in that process? What enzymes are needed, and kind of why do we feel crappy and then feel good, and how do you get to the other side? So call it flipping the switch. And also talk about the difference of going more low carb, high fat as an athlete compared to the regular normal person out there. We're a little different. We exercise probably each day, probably more than once a day. Sometimes we might have 2 sessions one day. And, you know, the information out there is confusing. One is the research has low carb, keto, and carnivore isn't necessarily designed for athletes and women versus men. And I think women and their women's health and menstrual cycles we need to address, and how much is too low of carbs, and if we need carbs, is confusing. If you have higher stress levels, that's a big thing. And, you know, I'm trying to figure out what the answer is myself as I research, well, if you have chronic stress, if you have HPA dysfunction, if your blood sugar dysregulation, you should eat this way. And I think it gets confusing. We'll jump in. All right, so Peter's here, and we're going to dive into the process of becoming fat adapted, talk about metabolic efficiency and the whole OFM process. So optimized fat metabolism is Peter Defty's specialty and his program, and VESPA. And Peter, thanks for coming on once again for our kind of last minute show to talk about hot conversation topics we're finding on social media.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be on. And actually, it's not last minute, Debbie, because you and I have been working on this way ahead of this curve. Like you just said, you know, you go to your library, you started talking about this in 2011. I was talking about this in, 2000, 2001 on myself, and then starting to coach a few friends in 2003. And, it just makes sense. And that's probably the starting point is, the listener really needs to step back and go to what I kind of talk about. It's like the reason we carry a lot of fat on our body is that is what is meant to be our aerobic energy source. Mm-hmm. And glycogen, glucose is our fight or flight source. And we actually have this very robust supply of fight or flight fuel, in case we were in a prolonged battle or flight or something that was critical. We have this 2-hour storage level for fight or flight, which is seconds of doing this, spurts of activity, right? And yet we humans in our human ingenuity have gotten it all wrong. We're using the fight or flight fuel for our aerobic fuel, and there's a lot of cost to that. So that's sort of the part is people need to really hone in on that basic concept is we're really meant to burn fat aerobically, and we can burn fat at high rates and very high aerobic intensities. And this is what the FASTER study actually showed.
So what I wanted to dive into today is that, all right, so we've talked for a long time about how everyone needs to be fat burners. So metabolic flexibility, I just did a podcast with the other day explaining what that is. But ideally, we're all supposed to be burning fat at rest and during majority of our workouts, unless we're doing, high intensity interval training. Your metabolic efficiency testing I did for years, we can really test people to see where they switch from a higher percentage of fat for fuel to more carbohydrate for fuel. So we can see that. And then we're coaching people now in nutrition how to burn fat, not be depending on the sugar burning. So I always like the analogy of feeding a fire, kindling to keep it burning versus feeding the fire big fat logs and keep it going. And hopefully everyone's read Volek and Finney's books years ago, and the Maffetone, and get the free blogs on your site. But what I want to dive into, because you're Mr. Sciencey, smart guy, if you're starting with a high carb, typical standard American athletic carb burning fuel source athlete, what is a process when we're trying to so-called flip the switch to be a carb burner to become a fat burner, that fat adaptation process to optimize our fat metabolism? Let's dive into this, get sciencey, geek out on the whole beta oxidation and the enzymes needed and all that. So it's kind of
okay. Well, I'll probably miss a few things, and I'll try to simplify it and have some of the science out there, but not get too deep in the weeds, right? And then offer what are the practical everyday type of strategies we use to do that. So go back to that thing I just said. We're all meant to burn fat for aerobic metabolism. And unfortunately, to simplify things, we humans think in binary terms: black, white, yes, no, fat burner, carb burner. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not like that. We are not ever not fat burners. Even the carb burners have to burn fat, because if you're not metabolizing fat, you're dead, because you need fat metabolism, lipid metabolism for every function in your body. Yeah. That's what makes the cell walls, the proteins, the hormones. You need that metabolic pathway. Fat is the carrier of all the proteins, the fat-soluble vitamins. It's called lipoproteins, cholesterol. Lipidology is a very complex, well-studied part of human physiology, but it's not well known, and it's been dumbed down to this a few LDL and HDL numbers that have kept people where they are and resulted in this, $30 billion a year statin sales thing. So, So you're always burning fat, even if you're carb burning. So it's not a one or another. It's how much of each, and that's why you want to optimize it. So a carb burner is burning fat, but is it optimal? And like if you're a keto burner, is it optimal? I would venture to say probably not, because deep ketosis is a conservation state. It's a great tool, but it's a conservation state. So people need to know that. It is a tool we use to help make that switch, because it signals to your body that it needs to burn fat. Because when you're a carb burner, I'm going to simplify it really simple, because it's not entirely that, but let's talk about the insulin question, because most consumers, most people out there know about insulin. And insulin's the hormone that controls blood sugar. It does a number of other things. We won't go too deep in that, but I'll mention that later. But it controls your blood sugar. And if you're eating a lot of carbs, that's what keeps the glucose, the sugars and the carbs, from killing you. Because if you're a type 1 diabetic and you eat a lot of carbs and you don't give yourself insulin, you fall into a diabetic coma and die. Well, the same physiology is occurring in healthy, quote unquote, healthy people's bodies. However, our bodies know, our pancreas knows to secrete insulin when it senses the blood sugar is getting out of whack, out of that homeostasis, and it drives it down. So, but the problem is if we're eating chronically a lot of carbs and burning a lot of carbs, we're secreting way more insulin than we should. It's like I say, we're looking at insulin all wrong because of the diet and because of the way the treatment of the high carb diet has reflected on the general population, with the diabetes epidemic, that we're using insulin as a blunt hammer to drive down blood sugar instead of the surgical tool it should be. Like when you're an athlete and you're metabolically healthy and a fat burner, you're low insulin, you're insulin sensitive. Well, all of a sudden, insulin becomes very anabolic, and it helps drive the energy in to drive the anabolism and a host of other things. It's a wonderful hormone in that context of low insulin, high insulin sensitivity. But by not doing that and having this high insulin, it's telling your body, we got to get rid of the glucose. So as Finney and Bollock say, glucose becomes the metabolic bully. It cuts to the front of the line because you have to get rid of it. Okay. And when you have high insulin, the whole drive is to drive down blood sugar. Well, that's why people who are carb burners tend to eat, and 2 or 3 hours later, they got to eat again now, because they get hangry.
The blood sugar roller coaster.
It's a blood sugar roller coaster because when you have high insulin, you're not clearing the insulin. You're clearing the glucose, but you're not clearing the insulin. And so that's where that roller coaster, that constantly snacking hunger comes from. And so when you go get fat adapted, you have to get off that. And it's literally a substance withdrawal. It's no different than alcohol, illegal drugs, prescription drugs. You've so caused an imbalance in your hormones and physiology that you have to go through this detox withdrawal state to get it back. So you got to go off the carbs. Now, the strategies to do this in the real world for an athlete is athletes tend to be better fat adapted than sedentary people because they're active and because it helps upregulate mitochondria, blah, blah, blah. So I suggest people do it at the end of after an Ironman. If they do an Ironman, right after an Ironman is a good time to do that process because your body actually is pretty predisposed.
Yeah. So let's talk about the process. So for example, this is January when we're recording this. A lot of people are on the Facebook group page and like keto people that aren't athletes, for example, I keep reading these comments. Oh, I need sugar, or I need this. And it's just like there's a transition period when you're going from eating this. I think everyone must be eating 10 of carbohydrates. They're having such withdrawal symptoms, but for athletes, so you're probably more efficient fat burning if you're an athlete switching from a high carb to low carb. So it's going to be a little different process, but generally speaking, everyone, when they start going through kind of a sugar detox and a fat adaptation process, how do we go from metabolism, primarily carbohydrates, getting off that blood sugar roller coaster? Could you kind of talk about the enzymes and cofactors in the Krebs cycle? Can we simplify that? I know people can go to your website, but optimal fat metabolism, how do we optimize that fat burning effect? The process of say 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks for people to flip that switch from being depending on carbohydrates to fat, and because people often feel crappy and they're low energy, and that's why you want to do this end of a race season, or when you're kind of
right. Okay, so here's the thing, because like I said just now, high insulin is shunting your body's physiology to burn glucose, and but unfortunately it gets so high that you overburn the glucose in your bloodstream because there's so little of it there, and then you're going to go into this thing. So you got to get the insulin levels down so that the other hormones can start to upregulate, like glucagon to make glucose, the signal, the hormonal and enzymatic signaling that makes that ketones. Now this is a little technical. This is not what the keto community talks about because they're not looking at this, but your liver always makes ketones. It's always producing ketones. Now, those ketones are a substrate for a number of things. It's not just beta hydroxybutyrate for ketones in your blood. And this is where people don't understand, is you need that signaling that says, oh, we need some extra energy, so let's grab those ketones my liver's making and put them into the bloodstream for energy. So you need that signaling too, and you have to get the insulin down, and you have to get that scare state so the body knows to be able to put those ketones out there, plus the cells, the muscle cells and the brain cells adapt to upregulate the hormones and enzymes it needs to be able to utilize ketones. And then and that's why ketones and glucose are interchangeable fuels. And in a lot of instances, except for threshold and anaerobic work, ketones are the preferred fuel. Now, over glucose. Yeah, we see this in a lot of that. Now,
ketones and fat, or are you just saying ketones is?
Ketones is
Same.
beta-hydroxybutyrate. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those are your flex fuels. And what the audience needs to understand is your base energy, and the one that's most influenced by this whole high carb thing is beta oxidation. That's your base load, and that's where you burn fat for fuel. And it's just literally taking long chain fatty acids and just cleaving off these 2 carbon groups and getting the energy out of them in the Krebs cycle. And that's a 4-step process, and there's a lot of hormonal and enzymatic signaling. We won't get lost in the weeds, but it's a 4-step to get that long chain fatty acid into acetyl-CoA. Now, acetyl-CoA is what gets fed into the Krebs cycle to make ATP. And it's like I say, all roads lead to acetyl-CoA. So whether it's glucose, ketones, exogenous fuels, calories, proteins, it all ends up as acetyl-CoA and gets fed into the Krebs cycle. So beta oxidation is that base load, and you have to bring the insulin down to get that preferential switch going.
Yes. So that's kind of what I was getting to, is like, so it doesn't just happen in one day. It takes people more, sometimes longer duration.
2 to 3 days to 2 to 3 weeks to get that initial switch, because there's this withdrawal. And that's, when I say initial, that's your step 1. So it's like I say, this is substance withdrawal, folks. So that first initial step, you're gonna go through a lot of things where your body's saying, I have to have my carbs. This isn't working for my body. I'm unique. I'm an individual. And yes, you are, but this is just basic physiology that all humans have. Now, depending on the variables and your genetics, etc., everybody's different. Okay, don't exercise, or if you can exercise, just keep it low intensity, just because you'll feel a lot like somebody who transitions in 2 or 3 days. They might just, like somebody who's really a good fat burner, like a young fit male, they might just feel off for 2 or 3 days. Whereas somebody else, like a middle-aged male or female, might be on the couch for that first 3 to 5 days, and then taking another 2 to 3 weeks to adapt. So don't put additional stress on your body, whether it's physical stress or mental stress or emotional stress. Try to take the other stressors out, because you're putting a lot of stress on your body, and you want to take that off so you don't trigger those fight or flight hormones that are going to keep you from burning fat. Because once again, stress is a fight or flight response. It's going to really dispose you to burning glucose. So we want to be relaxed. We want to tell our partner, our coworkers, we're going to be cranky, a little, not so productive, and just give them a little time and just kind of pamper yourself.
So why is that people will feel crappy? Because their body's searching for fuel, so they have low energy, and that's they're not taking away the carbs. So
you're taking away essentially, in a very simple thing, you've taken away the energy source your body's adapted to using. And until those hormonal shifts, like the insulin getting down and the glucagon going up, and
so your body's trying to figure out
and enzyme, you can't access. So you're taking away the fuel source your body's adapted to using, but you haven't made that shift to accessing the energy source you want to get to. It's like it's there, but we're kind of reorganizing the shop, retooling the shop to access the fat.
Yeah. Exactly what I wanted to share with people. It's like, all right, we're starting this, fat adapted program. You're trying to optimize your fat metabolism, but what's happening while you're doing that? How come you can't just go low carb one day and you're fat burner? And people think, why do these different things happen? So you read people's symptoms and feeling crappy. And I just want to explain, the process of what's happening at cellular level. So you're saying acetyl-CoA, which I looked up if people want to know the definition. It's a molecule that participates in biomechanical reactions in protein, carb, and lipid metabolism. And its main function is to deliver the acetyl group to the citric acid cycle, which is the Krebs cycle, people might remember from college, and oxidize for energy production. So it's just a process of metabolizing. People depended on carb metabolism but there's a different enzymes and cofactors needed to create fat metabolism, right? So we need
right.
to figure
So
out
like I
how to
say,
get those.
all roads lead to acetyl-CoA. It's just each energy substrate has different hormones and enzymes that it needs to upregulate. And so let's talk about the steps. It's like what we see, and even I've had this discussion with Steve Finney. It's that initial phase of 2 to 3 days to 2 to 3 weeks, what I call a hard reset.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first step of that hormonal and enzymatic shift. And then we have what we call in OFM the adaptation phase, and that's another 6 to 8 weeks where you start to see these subtle upregulation shifts. So in that first phase, you go from being carb dependent and climbing the walls and lethargic to not climbing the walls, but you're not feeling at your peak performance either.
Mm-hmm.
And if you stay in deep keto, that's kind of where that's kind of where most people stay. They can go all day, but they don't have the kick.
So define deep keto. This is for a non-athlete or athlete. What is deep keto? It depends, obviously, for each person that people want to know.
Deep prolonged chronic ketosis would be where you're keeping protein moderate to low, fat really high in terms of the macros, and then carbohydrates super low and in the form of, say, non-starchy vegetables, because that way you're not transiting any carbohydrates. And if you have to keep the protein fairly low too, because if you have too much protein, some of that protein will get deaminated and converted into glucose. Mm-hmm. And so in doing that, that sets up the deep keto stage. And once again, it's that adaptation. The body adapts to this fat based energy substrate that's taking in. So it downregulates glucose burning enzymes like pyruvate dehydrogenase is the main one, and which is a enzyme that's really, really important for that quick energy supply. And other hormones and enzymes need to burn glucose quickly, and it upregulates that fat burning. So if you go into a prolonged ketosis state, you lose those hormones and enzymes you need to really be able to access glucose efficiently. Your body will do it, but just like when you're going from being a carb burner to a fat burner, you're going from a deep keto burner to introducing glucose into your thing because somebody said you need it for performance. If you've been in deep keto for, say, 6 months and you're doing really good, but you're kind of like dieseling along and you don't have that overdrive gear, you won't get it right away until those hormones are upregulated. So that's why you have to find that balance. And I don't call it metabolic flexibility. I look at it more as because you're not going from one to the other. You're really being able to access all the fuel sources, the fat sources, the ketone and glucose sources from the liver, the glycogen sources, and your exogenous intake, and just being able to drive that energy. That's really what I look at is how are we going to be able to get that energy into the cells and get it metabolized for ATP. Now, it goes back to that conversation we had about mitochondria. We want more mitochondria.
That was my next question.
because that increases the capacity. See, I look at this as this huge picture of all these things going on. And now and we're going to go back to the transition thing. The other thing is, one of the reasons most people feel lethargic is that signaling when you go off being a carb addict happens fairly quickly. And in that, what drives it is you're going crazy, but then as soon as that process starts to take hold, you go through this diuresis type of thing, and that's when you start to lose fluid.
I have to go to the bathroom. Go.
Okay, so we have this diuresis occurring. And that happens fairly quickly. Within the first 1 to 3 days, you start to tap into that glycogen, you start to run out of glycogen, and then all of a sudden the diuresis starts, and you start to lose blood volume. And that's one of the big things that people need to be aware of is as soon as they start peeing a lot, they got to start replacing the fluids, which is water and electrolytes, mainly salt, sodium, to maintain blood volume. Otherwise, you're going to just be chronically lethargic.
So
And
diuresis means like a diuretic, so having to go to
that's
the
right.
bathroom more.
Yeah, that's the technical science term, and I want to try to use the proper terminology. But yeah, it's going to PEP a lot, and you're that's the physiological thing that happens is when that switch starts to flip, it means you're starting to burn fat, and that's a great thing at a higher rate. The problem is most people continue to feel crappy because they're not adding the fluids in to maintain blood volume. And I see this. This is one of the more sensitive issues with fat adapted athletes is maintaining proper blood volume, both in and out of exercise.
But that means with the electrolytes, like putting the real
Absolutely.
salt, or because I just been doing that, and then I just got this supplement from Biotics I use for nutritional therapy that has potassium and magnesium, and I've been just trying to make in my own little concoction. But just having real salt is just amazing.
Yeah, you need the salt. Yeah, real salt for that maintaining blood volume. And if you're eating a whole foods diet, the only thing you really need to supplement with is magnesium, because it's just not, unless you're eating a lot of seafood, it's just not in the diet, today's diet, even with fresh foods. But if you're eating fresh foods, fresh meats, eggs, fresh produce, you're going to get plenty of potassium. You won't need to worry about that. But if you're in a fasting state, or if you're going through intermittent fasting and all that stuff, you may need to supplement with some potassium. So anyway, so those are the kind of the things. So we went through the hard reset. I gave you that little tip on maintaining blood volume through adequate fluid replenishment, which is not just water, but water with the right electrolytes.
Is that part of phase 2? So phase 1 is the hard reset.
And that's part of phase 1. That's like one of those things. As soon as you notice yourself going to the bathroom more and starting to feel a little sluggish, or you get out of a chair and you feel faint, or you bend over to tie your shoes and you feel a little faint, it means you're low blood volume.
Yeah.
And that's where the whole salt is bad for you goes haywire in the context of keto, because you need the salt, because what happens in a carb burner is their arteries get stiff, they start to close off, you don't have the volume. So if you add salt, you're going to add fluid, and those arteries, capillaries, and veins can't expand. So what happens is the pressure goes up. That's why you get the high blood pressure. That's in the context of a normal high carb diet that most people eat. That's why salt's bad. But when you become a fat burner, that inflammation goes away. So the inflammation in the soft tissue goes away. So all of a sudden those vessels are really pliable and can deliver oxygen. This is one of the performance advantages is if you get this all right, you can maintain blood volume. You can supply blood in and out of those cells really well, because you have this, what they call arterial distensibility of the soft tissue. So yeah. And then so phase 2 is when you're doing that subtle upregulation. Like I said, hard reset, you're off the addiction, you're not climbing the walls, but you're not feeling like you're at peak performance level. And that's why we got off
transition period. And that's when your body's trying to figure out how to make fuel from fat metabolism with acetyl-CoA into the Krebs cycle.
Right, but it's another phase of upregulation where you really start to, and this is where the training comes in. You're able to start to train, and through that training and reintroduction of carbohydrates, the combination gives you that ability to have the hormesis, the supercompensation, the adaptive stress. Those are terms that are out there, hormesis or adaptive stress or supercompensation. That's what training does. But the training combined with the dietary changes and the reintroduction of carbohydrates, at different levels. We start by adding them in during long workouts to give you some added calories. We start to add a little bit in before and after hard workouts or long workouts. These help drive you so you can push your workout. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So that's like what the last part of the conversation today I want to go into. But there's the phases, but you're saying, to reintroduce carbohydrates. So right there it gets confusing, and you listen to, read all these posts and stuff from different carnivore and keto people in the keto world. Carbs are not necessary. We don't need carbs. But what if we're comparing the fat adaptation process for endurance athletes? do we need to reintroduce carbohydrates, and why, if so, and then when? And that's another podcast to do on the carb timing. But that's what gets so confusing. You read these different things, and I always say N equals 1, eat real food, balance your blood sugar, figure out what works for you. But so many people like, oh, you don't even need carbs. Carbs are unnecessary. All you need is protein and fat. And the people doing, the nose-tail carnivore. And then I get the nutritional therapy side, FDN, is people, all right, if you have chronic stress and your blood sugar is dysregulated, it's too much stress to go too low carb, so you should have some carbs. So that's what it's like. Everyone's just trying to follow this one-size-fits-all approach, and we have to individualize it with a proper coach that will help you. And what I'm doing is more the health detective process of using functional lab testing to figure out, okay, if none of that works, what else is going on that are these hidden stressors impacting your hormones, immune system, detox, digestion, and energy system. So with that, what's your thought of, okay, you say to reintroduce carbohydrates for athletes, how that's different than the regular person?
That's in the adaptation phase. Now, in the hard reset phase, that's when we look at these underlying issues. Like I said, it's a 2 to 3 week process, and like I do a hard reset where it's like a 4-week process, just to have that little extra week of cushion, right? Mm-hmm. But by the second week, if we're not seeing really good at it, some solid signs that somebody's adapting, that's when we start looking for underlying issues that are preventing that person from making those shifts. And that's when starting to look at lab tests, or starting to dig deeper into the person's personal life in terms of, do they have something going on that's keeping them chronically stressed out? There's all kinds of different things that could be going on. Do they have a genetic history of having some sort of underlying thing, or are they just genetically somebody who needs a little bit more glucose? Especially with females, and say with a history of a lot of antibiotics, a lot of processed foods earlier on, some things going on that wouldn't do it. So you want to start looking at those underlying things, and certainly looking under the hood with various labs. And you have to, depending on the person's ability to finance them, whether it's through insurance or cash, whether it's lab work, biome analysis, stool analysis, all these things that you can kind of look at that can give you markers or proxies to see what might be going on is definitely important. And that would occur before that adaptation process. Because I don't really want to start to introduce significant carbohydrates back in to kind of find that tolerance level and that fine balance until you have somebody kind of pretty solidly in that camp of having their physiology back to where nature intended, which is, a fat burner.
Yeah. But I just think athletes need to realize that we're in a different category of someone that doesn't move. It's a typical American inactive person. It's going to be a little different.
Yeah.
But that's what's confusing.
Well, and this is something else. Yeah, this is something I want to point out. If you're not highly aerobic, and I'm going to be a little controversial here, it's not just being an athlete. You got to be fairly aerobically fit. You can still be a gym rat, but you got to be doing enough aerobic work to build your aerobic capacity on a fat-based physiology, because that's what humans evolved to be. These really fit, super strong, super aerobically fit animals. And so the thing I want to posit that's really important for people to take in and get is, when you get an athlete that's fat adapted, aerobically fit, doing some interval and strength training in conjunction with that, like you say, is a very different person physiologically and metabolically than the sedentary person.
Yeah.
And the problem here is the body of science is based on a sedentary model.
Exactly.
Not the model and it's based on a diet. So the physical activity level and the dietary intake that the whole thing is based on two really key false assumptions. So, and what I say is if you're not physically active and aerobically fit, you're in a disease state.
Mm-hmm.
Being sedentary to me is a disease state. And that's one of my out there things. I know when I have to be politically correct, but really, when you think about from the evolutionary model of how we existed for most of human existence, we were really physically active, and that's why athletes even carb burners tend to be healthier for longer. It's like even a carb burner will, unless they start getting, they'll eventually get something. It's not a question of when, it's if, but they won't get it as soon. They won't get as fast as, say, a sedentary person. Like somebody getting diabetes in their 30s might, if they were active, they might start seeing signs in their late 40s or when they moved up from a 10K to a marathon. So that's something really important to understand is that this model that a lot of this stuff you're seeing on, people like to cite the science and throw papers around like swords and sabers that, I'm right because this paper says this and all this consensus says that. And then the other person has this different paper that says exactly the opposite. Well, you're right. It's totally confusing, but just understand that the sedentary, we're kind of on this cutting edge frontier because people are forgetting to look at this in the context of active people. And there's all kinds of parameters like things with ketones and blood sugar, cholesterol levels, all these markers that are commonly used for health stuff. With a fat adapted, aerobically fit, the markers are really different, and for a sedentary person, that would be a sign of danger.
Yeah, and I think for the OFM process is more geared towards the athlete, more endurance athlete, or anybody?
Any athlete, because exercise is, to optimize your fat metabolism, you have to have that exercise in there to drive that adaptive stress so you get that hormetic response, the supercompensation. So you build more mitochondria. You don't oxidize the mitochondria from burning the glucose, on a mitochondrial intercellular level, and then you're building up your cell walls. You're because you're fat adapted and optimally, your body's taking those substrates and making cell walls, whether it's for muscle cells or ligament or myofascial sheath or hormones or enzymes. It's all trying to optimize not just the metabolism for energy, for that acetyl-CoA to feed into the Krebs cycle, but it's also optimizing all those other physiological processes that make us human.
Yeah, I think it's great information. And I just wanted to say that I think the confusing part is, if we'll do next time, I think we should go into our carbohydrates needed, because so many people are saying you don't need carbs, and then you do need carbs, and you listen to everyone's got different opinions, and I think it goes back to N=1, but when is it appropriate to add more carbs? Look at the woman's cycle, look at someone's stressors, if they just need to go no carb, and when are you causing more harm than good? As I said, I was low carb, high fat. I did bulletproof coffee. I did fasted workouts, and I don't blame that of me becoming broken starting since 2013, but I did that on top of a stressful life. And I did that on a lot of races. I was very metabolically efficient. I could burn fat up to 160 heart rate, and my body, I was strong and I was fit, but suddenly my book, Life is Not a Race, is all about it. But it suddenly was like, I couldn't do anything, and damaged my body since. So I think it's something I really am passionate about sharing. It's like, when is it too low carb, or when are you fasting too much? And how do you know? Because it's so individualized that we need to look at our own individual red flags that maybe I don't need to go as low carb because I'm feeling like crap and my workouts are crappy. But everyone says no carbs are needed, and what type of carbs? And so maybe next time we can go into that. But any thoughts on that? And then finish up with your tips for OFM, and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, a couple things here on the carbs. Deep keto is a conservation state. When you're really in that state of keto, it's a conservation state. So your body wants to conserve. So when you start pushing down the gas pedal and want to go performance-wise, it's like, you got a Prius and you just rolled out onto the track at Le Mans, and you're going to race with some you just don't have the engine there. And that's what the training and adding that fast burning fuel in the right amounts and very strategically. That's the thing, like you're saying with women, timing that carbohydrate based on their cycle and where they're at that time, because where they're at, like a woman, like where she is in her fat adapted journey, where she is today may be 6 months from that. Then when she's better adapted, she might be very different. That changes. We've had several women who've gotten pregnant. They get preggo, including women who were going through perimenopause. I've had one client who got pregnant in perimenopause because her hormones started to come online and come into balance. So that strategic carbohydrate really helps make health if you're a training, because you need that stress to keep rejuvenating the cells. Now, the other thing I will finalize with the audience to think about, like stay tuned for the next episode on carbohydrate reintroduction, is this. And another one of my wild theories that I'll put out there that's really counter to the keto, carnivore, you don't need carbs thing is the better, like a fat adapted athlete, the better tolerance they have for the carbs, the more they quote unquote work to give you that threshold anaerobic push. The more you can use and the more you can take advantage of carbohydrates in that strategic fashion for performance, that is a sign of just how well fat adapted you are. It's a really good marker for me of a how well you adapted you are, is how well you can handle a bolus of carbs, whether it's a pre-race carb or in-race carb. Does it work like rocket fuel to really fuel your performance? Because like I say, we look at concentrated forms of carbohydrates like starches and your nutrition, whether it's liquid or gels or whatever you're taking in race. We look at that as a legal PED because it fits that total definition. Use it right, it's going to make you go like crazy. But if you overuse it, it's got a lot of unintended consequences. So think about that. The more you can tolerate carbs and get the performance benefits without impacting your fat adaptation, the better fat adapted you are. And that think about using carbs like a legal PED.
Got it. Yeah. And
then, stay tuned for.
Another conversation on the carb, because I think that's so individualized, of course. Again,
we could have a whole podcast on trying to figure out how to use carbs on females.
Yeah, I'm researching that, and then on women and fasted workouts and intermittent fasting and tweaking that, because it's, when are you causing your body to go into hibernation or being scared of not getting food versus, all right, I'm going to be able to burn fat. So that's a whole nother topic, but I think it's
it's
something for
amazing.
Women.
Yeah.
So I will put everything in the show notes, but just, I think the OFM process, we can send them to your website to learn more. And then there's coaching programs available as well.
Yeah. And of course you coach this way. So once again, the VESPA product has from an observational standpoint really shown to be a good tool for helping, with this. And then there is a study going on and the initial data is actually corroborating that.
And my coaching is, I'm including, it's a 90-day program, but I'm doing my kind of health detective work. So I'm incorporating this process with clients individually and working on their holistic method elements. I work on nutrition, exercise, but then the stress and sleep and the movement mobility drills and getting digestion and good gut health, hydration, and happiness. Make sure you're playing and laughing and being silly. Yep. But then I do that with the FDN process where we do the functional lab testing. So it's really exciting to start doing that with clients individually. It's a 90-day commitment, but just to put the pieces of the puzzle together in their individual case. So if they are trying to do OFM on their own, trying keto and trying all this stuff, and it still doesn't work, my side of it is I'm going to help undercover those hidden internal stressors that you don't know about unless you look under the hood. So there's these, we always talk Maffetone years ago said being fit and unhealthy, but you don't know what's going on inside of you unless you do the functional lab testing. So instead of guessing and being stuck in the cycle of trial and error, that's what I'm trying to resolve and help people rebuild and restore their whole health from the inside out.
Yeah. Yeah, usually for me with, our optimized fat metabolism, we offer like the same thing, a 3-month program that mentors people in this, and it's a great way, like what you're doing, you need that 3 months commitment from the client to really, not just look under the hood, but diagnose. And like usually in the first 2 weeks, if something's not happening, you're starting to look at like doing labs and asking some questions about their personal life. I mean, it's amazing the range of things clients have shared with me, and I'm not going to go into that, but it's kind of like mind blowing. But then when you uncover these underlying things that happen in their lives and have them, have that, what I call the come to Jesus meeting with an underlying stressor, it's transformational. That's not even related to physiology. It's just related to brain hardwiring and just how much that affects their physiology.
Yeah.
So you just got to get them there, and like you say, it's a very holistic thing. And then working with somebody who has that approach, it's not, a lot of the science driven people think it's like woo, but no, it's like, yes, we're using the science, but we're also looking at the reality of that human condition.
Well, that's why I like doing the lab testing with people. So you have the science and you have the evidence of here's what's going on under your hood, and then let's work on your lifestyle factors. But it's fun.
Yeah. So, like if your cortisol's up and nothing's working, it's like, what's going on here?
Yeah. Well, I have to get to work on coaching my clients, but I will say, and on that drives me nuts, because people are treating just doing hormone panel by itself and then giving them hormones. I find what works is just look at the whole picture. It's like, what is that? Why? And if you're still just taking, progesterone and taking estrogen supplements, testosterone, it doesn't really figure out why your hormones off. So that's why I always think you have to do the gut test and the oats test and other GI. And it's just crazy.
Yeah.
People are still just doing one lab.
Yeah, no, and I want to support you with that, because the hormone thing, I'm a big believer in using some hormone therapy when it's warranted in very small doses.
Yeah.
But first, let's get the physiology as good as it can, because a lot of times, as you're saying, if you get your gut working right and get the biome profile right, you get them fat adapted, the hormones come into balance. Like I said, we've had probably a half dozen different clients who've gotten pregnant by accident because all of a sudden their hormones came online. And boom, it all happens.
Yeah.
The magic happens.
Yeah. All right. So I got to wrap up here. So what's it? Say the website.
.io, like
.io,
ofm.io, think I optimize. Because we want, like I said, you're always burning fat, but you want to burn it optimally.
Yes. All right. So you guys send in your questions to Peter and myself, and we've got the Facebook page, the Whole Athlete for the podcast, and Low Carb Athletes, where I'm putting the research articles for you and different blogs and stuff that Peter can share, as well as a previous podcast that just was out with one of his athletes on OFM. So make sure you listen to that. And any questions on that, you can just post or send via my email, debbiepotts.net. So thanks, Peter. Next time we'll get into carb optimization and carb timing.
Okay, super. Thanks again, Debbie, and look forward to it.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Athlete Podcast. If you have any questions, feedback, or topic suggestions, let us know on Facebook or at wholeathletepodcast.com. You can help us continue and grow by leaving a review on iTunes. Thanks again, and see you next time.